They say empires crumble from within before they fall from without. In the year 527 CE, as the Byzantine Empire stood at the pinnacle of its power, a woman entered the sacred halls of the great palace of Constantinople. Her name was Helena Theodora, daughter of a provincial governor, chosen as bride to Emperor Justinian II, a man who valued political alliances over personal attraction. To the Byzantine people, she represented renewed hope, a fresh start after decades of palace intrigue and scandal. She was young, educated, beautiful by the standards of the age, and most importantly, she came from a family known for its piety and devotion to Orthodox Christianity. But beneath the purple silks and golden diadems of her wedding day, something darker was already stirring, a hunger that would transform her into the most scandalous empress in Byzantine history. At first glance, Helena Theodora seemed to embody imperial virtue perfectly. The chronicler Procopius, in his official histories, describes her as possessing the ethereal beauty that Byzantines admired. Luminous pale skin, dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, and the bearing of someone born to rule. She fulfilled her early duties with apparent grace, appearing at religious ceremonies in the Hagia Sophia, presiding over state banquets, and supporting her husband as ambitious building projects. In Byzantine society, where women were expected to be either saints or sinners with no middle ground, she was being groomed to be the former. But what if that rigid moral code itself became the catalyst for her spectacular fall? Did you know that according to manuscripts discovered in the Library of Mount Athos in 1876, Helena Theodora maintained a secret chamber deep within the Bucolian palace, not for prayer or contemplation, but for gatherings that would have horrified the monks who preserved Orthodox tradition? The manuscripts, written by a palace eunuch named Narses, who served as her personal attendant, describe in explicit detail what occurred in that hidden room. Senators' wives forced to perform in theatrical displays, while Helena watched from a throne inlaid with ivory and precious stones. Military commanders stripped of their rank insignia and their dignity. Priests, the very men who had blessed her marriage, coerced into participating in ceremonies that mocked the liturgy they had sworn to uphold. But these private gatherings were merely preparation for something far more audacious. By 532 CE, Helena had grown bolder, transforming entire wings of the great palace into what can only be described as a pleasure complex that rivaled anything Rome had known in its most decadent days. Imagine the scene: corridors draped in silk imported from Persia and China, their colors chosen specifically for their sensual effect. Chambers filled with incense that clouded judgment and lowered inhibitions. Recipes obtained from traders along the Silk Road who knew the secret properties of certain herbs. Wine flowing from fountains, not the watered wine of civilized dining, but pure, potent vintages designed to strip away the careful Byzantine reserve. The most detailed accounts come from what Procopius called his secret history, written after Helena's death when he no longer feared retribution. He describes how she would host what she called symposia of Aphrodite, events that began with the appearance of legitimate philosophical discussions. Scholars and nobles would gather, expecting to debate theology or politics. But as the evening progressed and the drugged wine took effect, the gathering would transform. Musicians would shift from sacred hymns to pagan melodies. Dancers would enter, performing movements that grew increasingly provocative. And then Helena herself would make her entrance, not in imperial purple, but in costumes that Procopius describes as more absent than present. She didn't just participate in these spectacles, she orchestrated them with the precision of a military campaign. Procopius records one event where she arranged a competition between herself and Constantinople's most notorious courtesan, a woman known as Antonina. The challenge: who could endure more partners through a single night? According to the Chronicle, Courtiers, military officers, and foreign ambassadors were compelled to participate, their involvement carefully documented by palace scribes. By dawn, Antonina had collapsed after servicing 18 men. Helena continued, surpassing 25 before declaring victory. The message was unmistakable. The Empress of Byzantium recognized no limits, acknowledged no shame, submitted to no authority but her own desires. Why would she risk everything for such excesses? Some historians argue it was pathological lust, an appetite that no amount of indulgence could satisfy. Others suggest political calculation, a method of controlling the Byzantine elite through blackmail and shame. But the secret history offers a third explanation, one that resonates with chilling psychological insight. Procopius writes that Helena once told Narcissus, "Power means nothing if it cannot transform the forbidden into the mandatory. I do not seek pleasure from bodies. I seek dominion over souls." When a patriarch performs acts that violate his vows, when a general submits to humiliation, when a senator's wife begs for what she once would have died to avoid, then I have proven that all virtue is performance, easily stripped away. Her victims spanned every level of Byzantine society. The prefect of Constantinople, discovered in her chambers under circumstances that destroyed his reputation. The patriarch's own nephew, forced into scenarios that made his continued service in the church impossible. Wives of foreign ambassadors, compromised in ways that gave Byzantium leverage in diplomatic negotiations. Those who refused her summons often met sudden misfortunes. A general found dead in what was ruled an accident, though the circumstances suggested otherwise. A senator's daughter who rebelled, later discovered to have voluntarily entered a convent, though her letters smuggled out told of coercion and threats. Even the Orthodox Church, the spiritual foundation of Byzantine identity, became a target for her perverse rituals. The secret history describes ceremonies held in a chapel she had constructed within the palace grounds. From the outside, it appeared to be a legitimate place of worship, decorated with icons and mosaics of saints. But the services Helena conducted there were inversions of sacred liturgy, holy vessels used for profane purposes, vestments worn by participants who were performing acts that would have merited excommunication, prayers recited backwards while engaging in behavior that Procopius, writing in Greek, struggles to describe, resorting to euphemisms and indirect references that nonetheless convey the horror of what occurred. Byzantine religious law was explicit about such blasphemy. Canon law demanded excommunication and civil penalties for anyone who desecrated holy objects or mocked the sacraments. But Helena operated with impunity, protected by her position and by the web of compromised individuals who could not expose her without exposing themselves. She had discovered that in a society built on reputation and honor, sexual humiliation was the perfect weapon. It destroyed without killing, ruined without leaving visible scars, and bound victims to their victimizer through shared shame. The scope of her operation was staggering. Archaeological excavations in the 1960s beneath what remains of the Great Palace uncovered structures that confirm the written accounts. Researchers found elaborate bathing chambers, far beyond what hygiene would require, their designs clearly intended for group activities, hidden passageways connecting different wings of the palace, allowing discreet movement of people who couldn't be seen using main corridors, and most tellingly, a series of rooms with unusual acoustic properties, designed so that sounds from within couldn't be heard outside, but everything spoken inside could be clearly heard from a concealed observation chamber. These were not spontaneous excesses. This was infrastructure, built deliberately and at enormous expense. Analysis of the construction materials and techniques dates these structures to precisely Helena's reign. She hadn't inherited a palace of sin. She had created one, transforming the seat of Christian imperial power into what Byzantine chroniclers would later call the New Babylon. The psychological damage extended across generations. Records preserved in the archives of noble families show elevated rates of familial breakdown, religious crisis, and what we would now recognize as trauma responses in the decades following Helena's reign. Sons and daughters of compromised nobles often fled to monasteries, not from piety but from inability to cope with what they had witnessed or learned about their parents. Several prominent families simply ceased to exist, their lines ending not in violence but in voluntary withdrawal from public life, as if participation in Byzantine society itself had become unbearable. But Helena's greatest transgression came not from her private ceremonies, or even her public spectacles. It came from her attempt to legitimize and institutionalize her practices. In 537 CE, she convinced Emperor Justinian II to issue an edict that effectively decriminalized behaviors that had previously been prosecuted under both civil and religious law d'assuéry. The edict was carefully worded, speaking of freedom of private worship and protection of personal devotion, but everyone understood its true purpose. It provided legal cover for Helena's activities, making it nearly impossible for victims to seek justice or for church authorities to intervene. The edict split Byzantine society. Conservative factions, led by traditional aristocratic families and monastic communities, were outraged. They saw it as nothing less than the official endorsement of paganism and perversion. But others, particularly those already compromised or those who saw opportunity in the new order, supported it. For several years, Byzantium existed in a state of moral civil war, with two competing visions of imperial society battling for supremacy. Foreign observers watched in fascination and horror. Ambassadors from the Sassanid Persian Empire sent reports back to their court, describing Byzantine nobility engaging in behaviors that would have been unthinkable in their own strictly regulated society. Readers from as far as India and China brought back stories of the Purple Palace, where the Empress herself led ceremonies that mixed Christian symbolism with practices borrowed from ancient mystery cults. Constantinople, the Second Rome, the defender of Orthodox Christianity, had become notorious throughout the known world. The breaking point came in 541 CE, but not for moral reasons. A plague, later called the Plague of Justinian, swept through the Byzantine Empire, killing millions. In a society where disease was understood as divine punishment for sin, the plague became proof that God's judgment had fallen upon Byzantium. Religious leaders who had been silenced by fear or complicity suddenly found their voices. The plague, they declared, was the direct result of allowing sacrilege and depravity to flourish in the imperial palace itself. Popular uprisings began in Constantinople's poorer districts. Mobs attacked known associates of Helena, dragging people from their homes and subjecting them to public beatings. Several buildings rumored to have hosted her gatherings were burned. The imperial guards, divided in their loyalties, did little to stop the violence. Justinian II, facing the collapse of public order and pressured by military commanders who had remained untainted by Helena's influence, finally acted. On the night of September 15, 541 CE, Helena Theodora died. The official announcement claimed she had succumbed to the plague that was ravaging the city. She was 42 years old, but the palace physician's report, sealed in imperial archives and only discovered during renovations in the 19th century, tells a different story. It describes symptoms inconsistent with plague: sudden onset of paralysis, bleeding from the mouth, convulsions characteristic of certain poisons known to Byzantine medicine. Her death was met with public celebrations. People who had lived in fear for over a decade could finally breathe. The Senate immediately began dismantling the legal protections Helena had established. The church conducted elaborate purification ceremonies in every building suspected of having been used for her rituals. Within months, workers were busy destroying the hidden chambers, removing the elaborate decorations, filling in the secret passages. The physical evidence of her reign was being systematically erased, but the psychological damage proved more permanent. Byzantine society never fully recovered its moral confidence. The generation that came of age during Helena's reign carried scars that shaped their behavior for the rest of their lives. Many became extremely rigid in their religious observance, as if trying to compensate for what they had witnessed or participated in. Others became cynical about authority and tradition, having seen firsthand how easily both could be corrupted. The Orthodox Church, too, bore lasting damage. Several monastic communities that had remained pure during Helena's reign gained enormous moral authority and used it to push for increasingly strict regulation of both secular and religious life. This contributed to the growing divide between Eastern and Western Christianity, as the Byzantine Church became more rigid and uncompromising precisely because of its experience with Helena's corruption. Procopius, writing his secret history in the years after Helena's death, struggled to explain how such systematic evil could have flourished in a Christian empire. He concluded that the fault lay not just with Helena, but with an entire system that valued appearances over reality, that prioritized political stability over moral courage, that allowed evil to flourish as long as it remained behind closed doors. His final judgment on Helena is brutal. She proved that the most dangerous corruption is not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that wears the mask of virtue while destroying virtue. His very foundation stand today where the great palace once stood, now mostly ruins and archaeological sites scattered across Istanbul, and the silence is heavy. Tourists marvel at Byzantine mosaics and architectural fragments, admiring the artistic achievement while ignorant of what those walls once witnessed. But archaeologists working in the deeper excavations know. They've found the hidden chambers. They've uncovered the drainage systems designed for purposes no legitimate palace would require. They've analyzed the residues that still cling to certain vessels, confirming the use of drugs and substances meant to alter consciousness and lower inhibitions. The most haunting discovery came in 2003, during excavations preparing for a new museum. Workers uncovered a sealed room that had been deliberately filled with rubble and concrete, as if someone wanted to ensure it could never be used again. Inside, beneath centuries of intentional burial, they found the remnants of what can only be described as a throne room, designed for obscenity. The throne itself, carved from purple-veined marble, was positioned to overlook a circular space where participants would have been clearly visible. Around the walls, barely visible beneath centuries of deliberate defacement, were frescoes depicting scenes that museum catalogers struggled to describe in academic language. Most disturbingly, they found boxes, small containers made of precious materials, each sealed with wax bearing Helena's personal seal. Inside were locks of hair, carefully preserved, each tied with a silk ribbon of different color. Analysis showed the hair came from different individuals, both male and female. Accompanying each lock was a small ivory tablet with a name carved into it, and a date. These were Helena's trophies, physical proof of her dominion over each person she had broken. When historians cross-referenced the names on those tablets with Byzantine records, a pattern emerged. Nearly every person whose hair Helena had preserved met an early death or disappeared from historical records shortly after the date carved on their tablet. Some entered monasteries under suspicious circumstances. Others died in accidents that raised questions even in contemporary accounts. Several simply vanished, their names ceasing to appear in any documents, as if they had been erased from existence. The story of Helena Theodora asks a question that resonates across history. What happens when absolute power combines with complete moral corruption? Byzantine culture prided itself on being the successor to Rome, the defender of Christianity, the pinnacle of civilization. Yet within its most sacred spaces, Its own empress had created a system of systematic depravity that rivaled anything pagan Rome had produced. Her reign lasted only 14 years, but its effects rippled through Byzantine history for centuries. The empire's moral authority, already challenged by theological disputes and political instability, never fully recovered. The rigid religious conservatism that characterized later Byzantine centuries can be traced partly to this period. A cultural overcompensation for the excesses Helena had demonstrated were possible, even in a Christian empire. Perhaps the darkest irony is that Helena was initially buried with imperial honors in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the traditional resting place of Byzantine emperors and empresses. Her tomb, crafted from porphyry and adorned with precious stones, depicted her in pious repose, hands folded in prayer, the very image of Christian virtue. For decades her grave was venerated by those who didn't know the truth. But eventually, as the secret history became known, and as more evidence of her activities emerged, the church authorities faced a theological crisis. How could they allow someone who had so profoundly desecrated Christian sanctity to rest in consecrated ground? In 610 CE, under Emperor Heraclius, Helena's body was secretly exhumed and moved to an unmarked location. Official records claim it was reburied in a remote monastery cemetery. Unofficial accounts suggest it was taken far from Constantinople and disposed of in a way that would prevent any future veneration. The tomb in the Church of the Holy Apostles remained, but the identifying inscriptions were removed. It became simply the tomb of the nameless empress, a monument to forgetting. When the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in 1204, the tomb was destroyed, its precious materials looted. Not a trace remains of Helena Theodora's final resting place, as if history itself conspired to erase her as thoroughly as Byzantine authorities had tried to erase her hidden chambers. Yet she cannot be completely forgotten, because the questions she raises remain uncomfortably relevant. How does systematic corruption flourish in societies that claim moral superiority? Why do communities tolerate evil as long as it remains behind closed doors? What transforms individuals from victims to participants to enablers? Helena Theodora was a monster, but she was a monster that Byzantine civilization created, enabled, and only destroyed when her existence became politically inconvenient rather than morally intolerable. The shocking sexual practices of the most depraved Empress of Byzantium weren't just her personal sins. They were symptoms of a system that valued power over principle, silence over truth, and survival over justice. She weaponized sexuality in ways that destroyed individuals, families, and ultimately, the moral foundation of an empire. Her legacy isn't in the pleasure she took or the suffering she inflicted. It's the proof that evil can flourish even in the most sacred spaces, wearing the mask of authority, destroying from within while the facade remains beautiful. Stand before Byzantine mosaics in museums worldwide and admire their beauty, their technical perfection, their spiritual symbolism. But remember that behind such beauty, within palaces adorned with such art, Helena Theodora created her empire of shame. The same civilization that produced sublime religious art also enabled systematic depravity. The same culture that claimed to defend Christianity also allowed its most sacred spaces to be profaned. That is her true legacy, not the scandals themselves, but what they reveal about power, corruption, and the human capacity for self-deception. Byzantium survived for nearly a millennium after Helena Theodora, but it never quite regained the moral confidence it possessed before her reign. She had proven that virtue was fragile, that corruption could wear imperial purple, and that sometimes the greatest threats to civilization come not from external enemies, but from internal rot that everyone sees but no one dares to confront until it bites.